We're going to introduce the speakers directly to give them ample time to present their papers, and then so we can have time for discussion. Our first speaker is Sarah McCarroll. She's a professor of theatre at Georgia Southern University, where she teaches theatre history and script analysis, and is the theatre program's resident costume designer. Sarah's scholarship focuses on the intersection of costume and actors' bodies on the historical stage, particularly in the late 19th century British theatre. Her work can be found in Theatre Symposium and in Theatre, Performance and Cognition, Languages, Bodies, Ecologies, 2016. Sarah's professional home is the Utah Shakespeare Festival, where she is costume shop manager. Oh, sorry. Well, in summary, she has a wonderful resume. And she holds a PhD from Indiana University and an MFA from the University of Alabama. So Sarah, thank you for being with us. The floor is all yours.
Thank you so much. And I'd like to add my thanks to everyone else's to the, is that me feeding back? Add my thanks to everyone else's, to the organizers for creating such a lovely event for us. I can also just do... Yeah? Oh, much better. All right. Okay, so... my microphones make me tense. In 1889, Oscar Wilde was living in Tite Street in London's upscale Chelsea enclave. One of his neighbors was the American portraitist John Singer Sargent, whose subjects that spring included actress Ellen Terry, then playing Lady Macbeth to Henry Irving's King at the Lyceum Theatre. Wilde was clearly impressed by his sight of Terry arriving for one of her sittings. Quote, "The street that on a wet and dreary morning has vouchsafed the vision of Lady Macbeth in full regalia, magnificently seated in a four-wheeler, can never again be as other streets. It must almost always be full of wonderful possibilities." End quote. Sargent's portrait, has become an acknowledged masterpiece, and what I wrote was, and today hangs in the Tate Britain, that's not actually true at the moment. Both the portrait and the dress are currently at the Museum of Fine Arts Boston for an exhibit on Sargent and fashion that I would kneecap someone to get to. The portrait shows Terry wearing her famous Beetle wing dress and presents her Lady Macbeth as a visual archetype of the dangerous feminine. Terry appears sinuous and snake-like, with the crown of Scotland held high above her long auburn braids, her face triumphantly raised. Her gown glints like a reptile's scales as light strikes the wings, heavily embroidered on its surface. The portrait is not a record of performance, however, although it may seem to be one. Lady Macbeth is never crowned on stage, and so far as I have been able to discover, there was never a moment in the production during which Terry held her crown aloft. The serpent of feminine evil that Sargent painted was not the Lady Macbeth that Ellen Terry played. In fact, her lady was a thoroughly Victorian wife. In this essay, I argue that Terry's Victorian interpretation of her role and her inescapably 19th century body asserting itself through the ostensibly period costume design worked to subvert the antiquarian depictions of medieval Scotland that should have been evoked by the dress. In addition, Terry's body contested audience performance memories and expectations for her character, ultimately resulting in a lackluster response to her characterization. The personal and theatrical ecologies that informed the creation of and audience response to Terry's performance include 19th century pictorial acting, antiquarianism on the Victorian stage, and the production history of Lady Macbeth. These elements blend together with Terry's own writings about her process and allow us to see how her Victorian body contests and ultimately overcomes the period memory that her costume attempts to assert over her body. That audiences responded tepidly to her performance points to the dichotomous ways in which Victorian society understood femininity and the ways in which they expected to see femaleness reflected from the stage. Victorian pictorial acting evolved from the declamatory style of the 18th century to serve the purposes of the contemporary stage with its increasing investment in visual realism. By the late 19th century, actors presumed that they would be employed within the proscenium picture frame, while audiences enjoyed the reverse presumption, that they would view the dramatic action through the frame. The proscenium called attention to the fact of being viewed, like any painting hung on a gallery wall, and therefore demanded that an actor's performance be externalized and markedly physicalized, directed outwards towards the viewers. The necessity for a pictorially performing body was compounded by the increasing tendency over the course of the 19th century toward realism in theatrical production values, which was required for the spectacle and sensation of melodrama to succeed theatrically. This investiture was coupled with the pictorial technique regardless of the setting of the play, including, perhaps especially, historically set pieces. The paradox of pictorial acting is that while it may show the audience a picture ostensibly in a historical moment, that image is always underlaid with the moment of the picture's author and viewer. In theatrical performance, to state the obvious, in front of a live audience, the author, the actor, and the audience are always of the same moment in time. The inescapable fact that stage productions always occur in the contemporary moment, regardless of the setting of the dramatic action, did not stop Victorian audiences from delighting in historical dramas. In 1823, James Robinson Blanchet designed for actor-manager Charles Kemble a, quote, historically authentic, end quote, production of Shakespeare's King John, and launched a fad for antiquarianism on stage, including at the Society theaters of the West End, whose houses were filled with well-educated upper and middle-class audiences. Antiquarian staging and design reached its zenith with Henry Irving, whose productions of history, plays, and historically, again in quotes, correct, Shakespeare made the Lyceum Theatre a central part of West End social life for the final quarter of the 19th century. Lyceum Shakespeare showcased historical accuracy in its most spectacular form. Quote, Irving's overriding concern was to achieve a fully pictorial display through the manipulation of theatrical space. Under Henry Irving, history was not so much restored as beheld, end quote. For Irving, antiquarianism and pictorialism were inextricably linked. When Irving and Terry appeared in his scrupulously researched historical productions, they became part of the same dynamics whereby society plays set in the contemporary moment worked as a mirror of upper-crust life and bodies, reflecting back to audiences well-remembered, vetted, and approved contemporary postures, gestures, and behaviors, thus reifying the physical paradigms of the outer West End world. Okay, good, got to, no, come back. Yep, okay. Ellen Terry had been a successful child actress, indeed she was part of a theatrical family, but left the stage at 16 to a disastrous marriage to the Pre-Raphaelite painter George Frederick Watts, who was nearly 30 years her senior. When her marriage to Watts dissolved, and I'm doing the Cliff Notes version of this saga, she began what was technically an adulterous affair with the architect E.W. Godwin, who would become the father of her two children, Edie and Edward Gordon Craig. Terry returned to the stage when the affair with Godwin ended in order to support herself and her children, having, as Michael Booth asserts, learned pictorial lessons from both men. As Booth sees it, Terry's pictorial technique was precisely what allowed her to reconquer the stage when her scandalous private life should have rendered her persona non grata to polite society. Quote, when Ellen Terry returned to the stage in the 1870s, she expressed through a combination of physical appearance, movement, voice, and indefinable presence, a poetic and aesthetic ideal of Victorian womanhood, representing not so much the domestic or chastely maidenish side of that ideal, common in fiction and drama, as a more physical temptress, whose sexuality was made acceptable and to an extent distanced by the conventions of poetic imagery and pictorial art, end quote. By the mid-1870s, Terry had joined Irving at the Lyceum as his leading lady in the antiquarian productions which he had made famous. In Terry, Irving had found an actress whose style was perfectly suited to his own. Both brought their pictorial sensibilities to each role. This pictorialism was perhaps never more on show than in the Lyceum's 1888 production of Macbeth. Like other historically set Lyceum productions, this Macbeth was to showcase a heavy investment in antiquarian design and pictorial performance. Irving and Terry traveled together to Scotland in 1887 to research the planned production, although Terry was very disappointed that the Scottish weather was lovely and didn't cooperate with mood. Irving's acting text of the play contrived to allow for as many major settings with as few full scene changes as possible. The majority of those changes fell between the acts, of which there were 6. In addition, as was often the case with Lyceum productions of Shakespeare, cuts to the play's text served to focus the dramatic action on Irving's character. Among other scenes, the onstage attack upon Lady Macduff and her children was cut. These excisions worked to increase Macbeth's stage time and to make his narrative arc as tragic anti-hero stand out starkly. Irving's interpretation of Macbeth differed on the inherited take of the character. In an 1896 article for Warner's Magazine, he explained, quote, "The generally received opinion regarding Macbeth has been that of a good man who has gone wrong under the influence of a wicked wife. This tradition has been enforced for many years. I think we shall find that Shakespeare, in his text, painted Macbeth as one of the most bloody-minded, hypocritical villains in all his long gallery of portraits of men," end quote. Given this interpretation of the title role, what was left to Terry as Lady Macbeth? If Macbeth was a bloody-minded villain, it became impossible to play his lady as the primary source of the play's evil. Terry was very well aware that an interpretation of Lady Macbeth that did not present her as the villain of the play would disrupt audiences' memories of past performances. In a diary entry after the production had opened, Terry recorded that, quote, "Those who don't like me in it are those who don't want and don't like to read it fresh from Shakespeare and who hold by the fiend reading of the character," end quote. The fiend that was lodged in the memories of audiences and critics was the standard performance of the role, grounded, quite obviously, in Malcolm's characterization of the fiend-like queen, which Terry inherited from earlier actresses, notably Sarah Siddons, who played the role as, quote, "a virago whose motivations appeared to spring from a hive of evil seething inside her," end quote. The Sidonian interpretation, which placed Lady Macbeth at the center of the play's arc, was never available to Ellen Terry. Ross MacDonald says, quote, "Recognizing her own dominant femininity, Terry developed a characterization that included and depended on that vulnerability, rather than trying to suppress or surmount it," end quote. This was a wise approach, given the relationship between the two leading actors in the production. Unlike Siddons, Terry would never have been able to centralize her role within the production. Throughout their association, her roles, her dramatic and theatrical capabilities, were always subordinated to those of Henry Irving. In order to support Irving's conceptualization of a bloody-minded villain, she could not have been the wicked wife even if she had wanted to be, and she didn't particularly. She had instead to be the loving support of a man driven to unspeakable acts by his own ambition. In notes Terry made in her scripts, it is clear that her conceptualization of Lady Macbeth aligned with the offstage dynamic of her partnership with Irving. Terry's lady was essentially a Victorian housewife, an aid to her husband and reliant on his masculine strength and energy for support. It is just her bad luck that she is yoked to a man lacking in these virtues. In one of her scripts, next to Lady Macbeth's, "When you durst do it, be so much more the man," Terry has scribbled, "This was meant to flatter him and urge him on." This flattery, a manipulation of Macbeth's masculinity, establishes the dynamic at work throughout the play. Lady Macbeth is a prop to her husband, not an instigator. Terry's Macbeth was not blind to her husband's faults. In fact, it is when the strength she expects of him begins to give way that she herself comes undone. As Terry understood her, Lady Macbeth was, and again I quote from her marginalia, "a woman, parens, all over a woman who, underlined, believed in Macbeth, with a lurking knowledge of his weaknesses, but who never found him out to be nothing but a brave soldier and a weakling, till that damned party in a parlor, the banquet scene as it is called, and then something too much of this, she says, and gives it up. Her, brackets, unquestion mark, mistakable softening of the brain occurs. She turns quite gentle, and so we are prepared for the last scene, madness and death," end quote. The character's primary motivation and the source of her tragedy was, in Terry's view, her unswerving love for the husband who betrays her faith in him. When Terry's Lady Macbeth discovers her idol's feat of play, she succumbs to that most feminine of Victorian traits, madness. Terry's final word on the matter is written into the fly leaves at the end of the play. Quote, "Lady M is capable of affection. She loves her husband, ergo she is a woman, and she knows it, and is half the time afraid, whilst urging him to not be afraid as she loves a man. Women love men," end quote. The most visual expression of the pressures, such as inherited performance tropes and Irving's approach, against which Terry's interpretation was working, was in the relationship of Terry's inescapably 19th century body with her historicized sensational costume. The question becomes how Ellen Terry's particular Lady Macbeth was expressed, or not, in her costumed body. How did the beetle wing dress fit on or into the characterization Terry set in her performance? Throughout her career, Terry had a preference for loose and light costumes whenever the period of a play allowed for them. The beetle wing dress for Macbeth was no exception to this preference. In How I Sketched Mrs. Siddons, a somewhat starstruck artist relates, quote, "There before me was Lady Macbeth in the glorious robe of green beetle's wings. Her face was wreathed in smiles, and the first words she said were, 'Is this not a lovely robe? It is so easy, and one does not have to wear corsets.' And she made a few delightfully graceful movements to show with what ease she could move." End quote. The knit underdress of the costume's bodice made this possible. This unboned structure also retains fidelity to the antiquarian values of the Lyceum. Medieval garments were not boned. The gown's design should also have reinforced the serpent-like quality that Terry's designer, Alice Commons Carr, was aiming for with her use of tinsel in the yarn's knit and the lavish applications of reflective beetle's wings, and which is so emphasized in Sargent's portrait. Paradoxically, however, this very physical freedom worked to counter the supposed period fidelity of the costume, as it allowed Terry's clearly 19th century body and Victorian embodiment of character to be easily read. In a book that she published entitled 4 Lectures on Shakespeare, that's the notes for a series of elocution lectures that she did, Terry muses that, quote, "It seems strange to me that anyone can think of Lady Macbeth as a sort of monster, abnormally hard, abnormally cruel, or visualize her as a woman of powerful physique with muscles of a prize fighter. I have already told you I conceive of Lady Macbeth as a small, slight woman of acute nervous sensibility." End quote. Terry's physicalization of the role did its best to imply a slightness, particularly in her interactions with Irving's Macbeth, that she did not entirely possess. Terry was 5'10". For instance, at the end of the banquet scene, one reviewer notes, quote, "Macbeth takes a torch from behind a pillar, but suddenly, in a paroxysm, hurls it blazing to the ground. He shrouds his face in his robe as he leans rapidly forward and rests against a pillar. The queen as swiftly kneels behind him and remains clinging to his skirts with an upturned face full of tragic solicitude." The visual tropes in this description are connected to Victorian traditions depicting gender relations between husbands and wives. The silhouette of the beetle's wing dress further reinforces this Victorian femininity. The gown insists on Terry's body as that of a woman. There is no hint at all that the spirits have answered her call to be unsexed. While Terry's body may have been uncorseted when she played Lady Macbeth, Terry's figure presented as a recognizable hourglass in her green gown. Sargent's portrait clearly shows this elongated hourglass shape, which directly reflects the silhouette of fashionable women's dress of the late 1880s. The shape is seen even more clearly in photographs of Terry in costume. Sargent slimmed her form a bit in his painting. In photographs, the fullness of Terry's bosom and hips is clearly more voluptuous, and there's a shorter vertical distance from the narrowest point of her waist to the fullest point of her hips. This hourglass silhouette that Terry's costumed body shows cannot be understood as neutral. Instead, it is laden with Victorian presumptions about womanly behavior. Women should be nurturing. Terry's bosom is emphasized by the stretch of her knit gown around its shape. In photographs, Terry's bosom is matronly and motherly. The actress, by this point in her life, had had 2 children and, like Lady Macbeth, had given suck. The curves of her breast are softer and lower than in her portrait. Her bosom suggests a place for a warrior husband to rest his head and find comfort, rather than appearing dangerously erotic. The body of this Lady Macbeth has been softened by her performance of her appropriately feminine duties. Victorian women were also expected to remain passive in the public political sphere. Duncan's assassination is obviously a political act, and as such should probably be something with which Lady Macbeth does not overtly concern herself. The private conversation she has with her husband notwithstanding, Lady Macbeth's most positive physical action in the play, positive and critical physical sense, is that she replaces the bloody daggers that Macbeth takes away from the grooms, and in Terry's characterization, she does so with reluctance. The supposedly appropriate passivity of the Victorian woman's body was visually reinforced in society and all but physically dictated by her clothing, and this stricture is clear in Terry's costume. Although the actress managed to rid herself of the confining corset, she could not free her legs from the swaddling of her skirts. Terry's portrait shows Terry's skirts pooled at her feet, so that even in seizing the power implicit in the crown she holds, she is irrevocably tied to the ground and immobilized. In practice, the skirts of the Beetle's wing dress do not seem to have extended beyond Terry's height quite so much, but they were certainly floor-length. Floor-length skirts visually and practically anchored Victorian women to the floor or stage. Visually, flowing skirts remove any sense that women might have a means of locomotion. More importantly, they restrain the body physically, pressing against and tangling with a woman's legs. In the case of Lady Macbeth, the physical constraint posed by her skirts also further reinforced the essential passivity that Terry understood as central to the character. It is clear that contemporary critics understood Terry's performance in the context of the Victorian body she presented. The reviewer of the Pall Mall Gazette wrote, quote, "The new Lady Macbeth is beyond all doubt a strangely impressive, subtle, and exquisite creature. We can well understand that she should turn her husband round her little finger. The difficulty is to explain why she should turn him in the direction of crime. With a woman of the excipitrine Sidonian stamp, we have not such difficulty. An insatiable thirst for power is the mainspring of her nature, and she loves her husband only insofar as she can rule him and rule others through him. But we cannot trace this thirst for power in Miss Terry's passionate, sensitive, and finely strung Lady Macbeth." End quote. The critic reads her performance as showcasing a domestic relationship recognizable within the understood gender dynamics of the late 19th century. But that clear understanding also presents the most obvious reason for criticism of her performance. Her Victorian lady does not match the performance memories of the role, and thus sits uneasily. Edward R. Russell in the Liverpool Daily Post calls attention to the banquet scene and the, quote, "splendid idea of Ellen Terry to stand behind Banquo, nervously and rhythmically assenting by unconscious nods and gestures and rapt, inarticulate lip movements until her woman's strength fails her and the cry is raised, 'Look to the lady,' and she falls." This failure of strength and Lady Macbeth's descent into madness makes the Shakespearean woman perhaps most suited to the Victorian stage. Elaine Showalter asserts that, quote, "even when both men and women had similar symptoms of mental disorder, 19th century English psychiatry differentiated between an English malady associated with the intellectual and economic pressures on highly civilized men, and a female malady associated with the sexuality and essential nature of women." End quote. Terry herself understood Lady Macbeth's end as particularly Victorian. Quote, "In plain prose, she has a nervous breakdown. She is haunted by the horror of the murder. It preys upon her mind and saps her strength. She dies of remorse. Surely this is good evidence that she is not of the tigress type mentally or physically." End quote. Neither a medieval fiend nor Miss Siddon's Augustan High Queen would have succumbed to just this type of insanity. Rather, the nervous breakdown was left to Terry's Victorian Lady Macbeth, in whose costumed embodiment audiences saw an all too recognizable woman. Ellen Terry's body insisted that the potential for evil existed not in an obvious serpent, unsexed and fiendish, but in the body of a Victorian wife. Audiences seemed willing to accept the disintegration of Terry's character's sanity as it coincided with contemporary ideas about the fragility of women's mental structures. But so her suborning of her husband to murder, her tidy, wifely organization of the deed, was anathema to ideas of how a wife and mother might act. It was easier, a relief, to reject Terry's characterization as misguided or out of place. Lady Macbeth needed to remain a medieval queen, a violent woman from a violent past, but well removed from the theater seats and drawing rooms behind its walls. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that wonderful paper. We're going to continue with our second one that I think has many points in common. Sorry. Okay, well, while we sort out the technical difficulties, it is with great pleasure that I introduce our second speaker. Dr. Caroline Radcliffe is a reader in drama and performance at the University of Birmingham. Caroline has published extensively on the dramas of Wilkie Collins, Charles Dickens, and on popular forms of Victorian theatre. Caroline has had a long career in performing, as we heard this morning, and her multimedia art installation, The Machinery, about 19th century women's industrial labour, recently received Arts Council England funding, so congratulations to that as well. Well, thank you for being here, Caroline, and for Thank
you. It's the graveyard slot. I'll try not to keep you long, it's fairly shortly, but I hope. Louisa Ruth Maynard was born in Bristol around 1831 to working class parents. Can you hear me? At around the age of 16, she apparently ran away from home to go on the stage, changing her name to Miss Herbert. Virginia Surtees, Louisa Herbert's great-granddaughter and biographer, records that on her death at the age of 90, she owned 17 images of herself by Pre-Raphaelite artist Dante Gabriel Rossetti, which were later sold and dispersed to galleries and libraries like Surtees. And yet, despite being described as a goddess of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood and an actress all the Pre-Raphaelites were in love with, and even by herself as a holy thing to them, in the recent Restaging exhibition at the Tate Britain, she appeared in only 2 images, and notably was referenced in neither. So this is one of the ones that she appeared in, and we put a helpful arrow to identify her, and then this was the other one, and again a little helpful arrow. Surtees says that in order to avoid any scrutiny and to preserve her own reputation, Herbert was extremely fluid with biographical facts, like many actresses, remaining discreet about her personal life, destroying all letters and papers relating to it, and, I argue, in the controlling of her own image. Herbert's early acting career has been traced back to an appearance at the Lyceum in 1847, followed by a series of appearances at provincial theatres in comedy farce and as Ophelia to Charlotte Cushman's Hamlet. I've just got behind with my slides, sorry. Just to give you an idea of some of the pictures that Rossetti did do, that none of them were shown in the Tate exhibition. That's just a handful of the many pictures that he painted, and that many of the other Pre-Raphaelites pasted there. By October 1855, she was making a name in burlesque at the Strand Theatre, and it was here, in February 1856, that Rossetti discovered her, describing her as stunner number 1. Ford Madox Brown, after viewing Rossetti's discovery, records his impressions in his diary. By May 1856, Herbert had secured a leading role in Tom Taylor's Retribution at the Olympic Theatre under the management of Alfred Wigan. Playwright and drama critic Tom Robertson was quick to link her to the Pre-Raphaelites, Millet, the artist, and sculptor Monroe, although he did also manage to identify her intelligence and a rise in dramatic talent amidst the overwhelming qualities of youthful grace and beauty. Ellen Terry, however, with her judgment perhaps less affected by desire, was less charitable about Herbert's acting ability, attributing her success more to her physical attributes and her undoubted suitability as an aesthetic muse. In 1860, Alfred Wigan left the Olympic and took over the management of the St James's Theatre, taking Herbert with him. Despite Terry's judgment of Herbert's acting, it's possible to situate her within a movement of increasing professionalism and a convincingly realistic acting style under Wigan's management. This fundamentally realist theatrical aesthetic coincided with that of the mid-century rise of the Pre-Raphaelite movement and the realism that's associated with that movement. As well as being commended as an actress whose style of acting coincided with this artistic imperative, Herbert was, more often than not, admired and objectified for possessing the beauty that resonated with these aesthetics. Described by Surtees as tall and graceful, with corn yellow hair, large azure eyes, a long neck, and a strongly defined jaw, Herbert brings the attention of artists including Ford Madox Brown, Van Prinsep, Frederick Sandys, W.E. Frith, George Watts, Dante Gabriel Rossetti, and Ruskin. But it was not until 1858, with the help of Tom Taylor, that Rossetti persuades her to sit with him. And this, going back, that was the picture that he was talking about. Daughter of a brass founder, Herbert had secured respectability in 1825 through her marriage to Edward Crabbe, a stockbroker, who, by the time she sat for Rossetti, had been unfaithful, abandoning her and her small infant child, by escaping to India, closing his bank account and avoiding maintenance payments. Haven't we heard that somewhere before? Yes, and this is not a picture of her, it's a picture of Lady Audley, as her husband rushes off to avoid his responsibilities. And I'll come to that later. There's similarities also when you look at Herbert's life and the way that she changed her name. So in Lady Audley's Secret, we see Lady Audley, starting off as tall boys, going through to Lucy Reyes, Lady Audley, and likewise Louisa changed from Louisa Maynard, Louisa Herbert, Louisa Crabbe with an E, and finally Madame Rochefort. Herbert embarked on liaisons with wealthy patrons, and her close association with the scandalous Pre-Raphaelites compromised her reputation, as she became further objectified and sexualised by the artistic and literary community. And Rossetti depicts this objectification with a sketch of her benefit performance in 1858. And you can see William Morris just behind her, all these men kind of fawning over her. As Rossetti became more obsessed, Herbert's radiant golden red hair, deep blue eyes and sensual lips became increasingly idealised and fetishised through his works. He depicts her alongside his established lover, Fanny Cornforth, as a rival for his affections. In Rossetti's image of Cornforth, Herbert's likeness can be seen on the wall behind her, a notable presence within the domestic and working space. Likewise, in an explicitly erotic pen and ink sketch made in June 1858, and the accompanying poem, which has been traced back to 1858, Beauty and the Bird, or the Bullfinch, describe the same event. Rossetti depicts Herbert feeding a caged bird with a seed from her tongue. The image has been identified as representative of Rossetti's relationship with both Elizabeth Siddal and Herbert, with Rossetti as the bullfinch, his affections fed by Herbert. Ironically though, and somewhat cruelly, the bullfinch had in fact been Siddal's own pet bird, and the bird is used by Rossetti to symbolise a place in his fading affections. Again, Rossetti depicts Herbert as usurping his love's position. Surtees identifies the small figure to the very bottom right of the sketch, which you can't see particularly particularly well as being Rossetti himself, a kind of puppet to her whims, I think. However, Surtees refutes any claim that Herbert was ever Rossetti's mistress, a fact that is perhaps significant in her afterlife as a Pre-Raphaelite muse. Herbert sat for Rossetti throughout 1858 and 9, but on the death of her childhood John Rochfort in 1859, the sitting stopped. Herbert appears to have been one of the few models to maintain independence from Rossetti, resisting his fetishistic appropriation of her and her image, creating a distance from him after 1859. I argue that she has since remained on the periphery of a continuing fascination and a fetishisation of Rossetti's models, accounting, for instance, for a lack of representation at the Tate exhibition. Mary Elizabeth Braddon published Lady Audley's Secret in 1862, and as Kate said, there were numerous adaptations throughout 1863. It was the big craze. It was an immediate success and was soon pirated. Objecting to the number of unauthorised stage adaptations profiting from the novel, George Roberts, real name Robert Walter's version, was the only drama to be sanctioned by Braddon. Robert's version opens at the St James's Theatre in February 1863 and featured Herbert as Lady Audley. Kate Mattox notes that dangerous female sexuality inherent in the role of Lady Audley, and that actresses in particular embrace Braddon's heroine as a means to articulate their own morally ambiguous position within society. Through her association with the Pre-Raphaelites, coupled with her ambiguous marital status, Herbert certainly conformed to this position. Further to this, Herbert's appearance as Lady Audley reflected and commented on her identity as a Pre-Raphaelite muse, indirectly reinforcing the Pre-Raphaelite themes implicitly and explicitly present in Braddon's novel. Mattox, again, states, Braddon clearly approved of the mediated respectability that Roberts infused into Lady Audley's character, to the extent that she wrote to its leading actress, Miss Ruth Herbert, to offer her congratulations on embodying her vision of Lady Audley's mingled madness and despair. Greatly acclaimed for her role as Lady Audley, Herbert then took over the management of the St James's Theatre between 1864 to 68, continually reviving Robert's production. Out of all the dramatic versions of Lady Audley's Secret, Robert's adaptation was the only one to include the scene in which George Talboys and Robert Audley discover a portrait painted unmistakably in the Pre-Raphaelite style. Much academic attention has been given to the Pre-Raphaelite imagery in Lady Audley's Secret, particularly the ekphrasis of the portrait scene, which, with its attention to detail and use of uncompromising realism, reveals the dangerous beauty and destructive and deceptive nature of the sitter. Lady Audley's portrait is likened by scholars to Rossetti's portraits. The description of the portrait easily conforms to Rossetti's depictions of Ruth Herbert, particularly Braddon's description of the deep blue eyes, the fair hair glinting with glimmers of red and gold. Braddon's use of colour, with its emphasis on red, the crimson dress in folds like flames, the ripe scarlet of the pouting lips, and the red gold gleaming in the yellow hair, recalls Margaret Oliphant's statement that when a very high effect is intended, red is the hue par excellence for sensation novels. For the final section of this paper, I discuss the extra-textual and meta-imagery presented to audiences and reviewers through Herbert's visual and theatrical representation of Lady Audley in the portrait scene, framing it within recent critical writing on theatrical intermediality. In an article from 2007, I introduced the notion of intermediality in the Victorian theatre of sensation, linking it to Bolter and Grusin's theories of remediation, immediacy and hypermediacy. By applying an intermedial analysis to the picture scene, it becomes apparent that its implicit significance on the stage was understood and conveyed both by Roberts the playwright and Herbert the actor. It even leads me to question whether Braddon in fact had Herbert in mind as the prototype of Lady Audley. In Mapping Intermediality and Performance from 2010, Robin Nelson states that throughout the history of the arts and media, different disciplines or arts have worked together in a range of combinations. But Nelson questions whether this might be termed transmediality rather than intermediality, a term he reserves specifically for digital mediatizations. I argue, however, that the presence of intermediality can be usefully identified in 19th century theatre. What I'm interested in is the inter in intermediality. What occurs between that meeting of different media, the immediacy this affects, and the modalities of experience resulting from this. At the moment in which the onstage portrait of Herbert as Lady Audley is revealed, the transmedial relationships between the literary, theatrical and the visual are specifically manifested and remediated, creating an intermedial presence perceived and understood by the audience. In the immediacy of the moment in which the Pre-Raphaelite imagery is revealed, the blurring of the fictional and the real with the biographical and the autobiographical are presented by the playwright and the actor, leading the audience to recognise and interrogate the meaning of the scene. Examining intermediality in performance as a mode of performativity, Kyle Kattenbell states, two basic features of the performance and the performative orientation, namely self-reference and self-reflexivity, remain to be addressed. Because of its constituting and staging aspect, a performance by definition refers to and reflects on itself and on the event in which the performance occurs. Audiences are aware, even during the most naturalistic presentations, that they are witnessing a staged reality, not actuality itself. Self-reference and self-reflexivity are not only characteristics of the performance itself, however, but also of the perceiver, who assumes the position of the spectator and of the audience. When the picture of Herbert as Lady Audley is revealed to the audience, what Kattenbell identifies as a process of or interrelations between media that result in a redefinition of the media, which by impacting upon each other provoke in turn a resensibilised perception, leads the audience to recognise the scenic moment on multiple levels, as Braddon's book, as a Pre-Raphaelite painting, as a new drama. They also see Herbert in multiple ways. Firstly, perhaps as Lady Audley, and secondly as Ruth Herbert, the actor-manager. But they might also identify the portrait as an explicit reference to Herbert's status as a Pre-Raphaelite icon. To conclude, theatrical representations, the sensation drama, functions on an assumption that audiences would understand and recognise elements of performance, not only from a dramatic and literary viewpoint, but from a wider cultural knowledge of pictorial iconography and literary and theatrical symbolism. When Louisa Ruth Herbert appeared on the stage of the St James's Theatre, she appeared not only in her capacity as the actor, but also in her capacity of manager. An actor-manager who's in control of the space, the money, the production, the actors. When both Herbert the actor and Herbert the Pre-Raphaelite image were presented simultaneously on stage. It was perhaps a way of reclaiming her own image by reversing the process of artist and sitter. Unlike Fanny Cornforth, Lizzie Sickle, and Rossetti's many other muses, Herbert seems to have resisted his desire to capture and fetishise her. Through performed self-reference and self-reflexivity, she merged the boundaries of truth and fiction, leading the audience to question biography and reality. Thus, she knowingly and ironically reversed the process of ownership.
Wonderful with time. So we have now around 10 minutes, or a little bit more for questions or comments.
You've all been stung.
We have one there.
Well, thank you very much for such wonderful papers. And my question is to Caroline. When I was listening to your ideas of intermediality and how they would be applying to the study of 19th century theatre, I couldn't help thinking about Louis Lotman's ideas of semiosis and science, and how he forms this triangle between painting and theatre and life to study Russian theatre. And I was wondering if you could find any ways of thinking about this intermediality in relation with these ideas on semiosis in 19th century Russian theatre by Louis Lotman. It was just coming to my mind.
I have to admit, I'm not familiar with that, so I'll have to have a little word with you afterwards and find out. But the original book that kind of inspired me by Katzenbach, I think had probably taken some of those ideas because they look at a very kind of triangular relationship between those elements. Yeah, I should look to revisit that.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you both. And again, wonderful papers, wonderful, and so beautiful to see Beetle being dressed. Do you know Veronica Isaac's work?
I'm sorry.
Do you know Veronica Isaac's work?
I do.
Yeah.
In the longer version.
At the VLA,
Yeah. In the longer version of this paper, her dissertation is quoted extensively.
Right, yeah. But I suppose my question was actually for Caroline, thinking of this a different triangular relationship, seems to me between the sitter for a painting, and in this case Herbert, the situation of Lady Audley's painting in her boudoir, and the kind of very sexualized nature of both those situations. And then the performance of the woman on stage. And what you're saying is that by her trying to upend that relationship, in what way do you think it changes the so I want to go back to the novel. You know, we talk about the adaptation from the novel, but what about the novel adaptation, as it were, from the theatre? Do you think that had the potential to change the reading of the novel? Because I'm thinking of that famous critic of sensation novels generally, who says in his review, I forget who it is, oh well, when you shake the delicate hand of the lady in her drawing room, you don't know what horrible things she's doing upstairs. So how might the performance change the reading of the novel? An impossible question, really. But
well, I mean, I think all the adaptations were so different, weren't they? The suit and the hazelwood, I mean, I'm always harking on about Wilkie Collins, but he talks about how he really seeks for his dramas not to be adaptations. He talks about them being alterations or new works, and so he's saying that he's creating a completely new theatrical work. And one of the criticisms of Robert's adaptation or alteration was that he just tried to pack too much in. You know, he had all the events going on, one after the other. It was only 2 acts long. And he actually just extended it to 6 acts in the 1870s because he clearly hadn't given enough space to this very considerable book. But I think what I'm interested in the way that Herbert, she suddenly comes out of character because you cannot not associate her with the Pre-Raphaelites. You know, everybody would have been aware, I think, of her status. She was so well known within theatrical and artistic circles, and that's I'm not really answering your question about the novel, but it steps out, it steps beyond the novel, it steps beyond the stage, it steps beyond the play, and that's why I'm so interested in Kaffenbauer's work about intermediality has to be something that functions with the audience perception, and that's really what it is. So you cannot rule the audience out of this factor, and it's the audience's understanding of those kind of signifiers and kind of semiotic significance that gives it this new meaning. So I'm very lazy about work on adaptation because I like to take the position of the 19th century dramatist. This isn't an adaptation, this is new work. You don't have to have read the book. You can see something totally new. This is a new drama. So I really like thinking of them as new dramas.
Thanks. Yeah, that's really interesting.
Thank you both of you, that was great. Quick question for Sarah, just for my own ignorance. With the Beetle dress, because of I'd always thought of the kind of sleeves like that coming out of Japanism and chinoiserie, or that kind of focus, I thought at that period I thought it was Japanism, and it was really interesting for me to hear your description was so beautiful of her bosom and how different it was from the picture, and it was so great to see that. And so I understood what you were saying about the Victorian body, kind of how different it was on the stage and what that meant. But could you tell me something about the sleeves?
Sure, yes, probably more than you want to hear. Terry and Alice Cummins-Carr, who was also a sort of aesthetic dress person riding the Liberty gowns, and Mrs. Nettleship, who was the maker of Terry's costumes and the Beatles' wing dress in particular, all took themselves off to what was then the Kensington Museum, the Victorian Albert, to go look at the medieval stuff. So they're really thinking about what that dress is in medieval terms. The construction of it, however, is fascinating. The weight of the knit is such that tinsel is almost it's almost fishing line. It's such a heavy twist. So you can't build it onto the knit over bodice because it would just stretch it all the hell. So the knit of those sleeves is hard set underneath what is the loose, essentially top of the bodice. And to my mind, it is most similar to the way we construct men's dance tunics today, where you build the sleeve onto an undershirt and then the vest is separate so that you get the most possible range of motion. The dress that exists, right, that's in Boston right now, is sort of a pastiche. There were multiple versions of this costume that but that is still very clear when you look at it. It's hard to see even in the pictures, but those two pieces function very separately, which has a very technical reason for it, and it's about supporting the weight of all that knit.
So would you be moving her arms?
Yeah.
Instead of not twisting her body?
Yeah, she could do a windmill. She's got so much rotation in there. If you look at, you have to sort of be suspicious of the photos of her in costume because they're studio portraits, even if they're on chunks of the actual set. But if you look at etchings, there's some really great etchings that you also have to be suspicious of that show what she was sort of able to do with dislocating her torso in a way to relate it to Irving's body that the corset would never have allowed her to do. Clearly, I'm all the way down this rabbit hole.
We have a couple more minutes. Well, I just wanted to say how, well, I don't dare, just the many things they have in common, and this idea of escaping the frames that were placed by artists on them. I was thinking about Terry wanting to present a different Lady Macbeth, and in the painting she's kind of forced back into that role, and having Herbert on the frame on the wall, and really wanting to, well, we all know what happened with Pre-Raphaelite muses and how they wanted to get out of that role, but thinking as well, when we think about the Royal Academy, the painting of the founding, the only two women were painted on frames on the walls, and then they repainted themselves. They did all these painting themselves within the painting to recover that, and it seems to also connect the world of women painters and women on stage again, connecting the painting and the artist using the dress as well. It all seems to come back to women artists in a more general sense, reclaiming coming out of the frame. It's not a question, sorry. Just
it's interesting. Yeah.
You can comment on that. Oh no, or ignore it, and we still have a couple more minutes.
I was chasing rabbits in my head. That costume had an ongoing life. Edie Craig put on private theatricals and women's suffrage pageants at Smallheath, which was Terry's retirement cottage. It's out in the countryside near Rye. So that dress continued to be worn, which as a sort of costume historian and archivist sort of horrifies me, but as someone who thinks of this as a living thing, delights me. And I sort of, it brings the dress forward through the frame in a new and different way, I think.
I think that's one of the interesting points in the Vulture and Grayson on remediation is that they really well, and Derrida as well, question this idea of authenticity and that is there ever an original? And that's partly why I kind of veer away from the standard adaptation trajectory, because always gives this, the novel or the original source this kind of hierarchy, this validation, and it really stops you from validating the other forms, I think. And I mean, obviously that's partly why 19th century drama has been so maligned, is that it's always considered second best to the novel. So that idea of a continuing life and, costume not being fixed in, for that production, I like that idea very much.
And it is so authentically theatrical, right? Like I work at the Shakespeare Festival in the summers, the first thing we do is go out to stock to see if we've got the thing that we need, right? The costumes don't go on dress forms in museums unless you were worn by Ellen Terry.
Well, I think it is time to thank our speakers again for this wonderful panel.